The night was thick with mist, the kind that blurred streetlights and made the air feel heavier. A young man, barely in his 20s, walked down the cracked sidewalk of a dimly lit neighborhood, hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. His name was Jordan Carter, a college student heading home after a long day. The world had been unkind to him in many ways, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity, shoulders squared, eyes forward. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, bouncing off brick walls and parked cars. A police cruiser rolled up behind him, tires grinding against the pavement. The sharp screech of brakes made Jordan stiffen, but he didn't turn around. He had done nothing wrong. There was no reason to be afraid. "Hey, hands where we can see them." A harsh voice rang out, cutting through the stillness of the night. Jordan froze. His breath caught in his throat. He had heard these stories before, stories of young black men stopped for no reason, stories that didn't always end well. Slowly, he raised his hands, fingers spread wide. He turned around, eyes meeting the two officers stepping out of the vehicle. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions cold. "What's in your pockets?" one of them barked. Jordan swallowed hard. "Just my phone. My wallet." His voice was calm, steady, but he knew that didn't always matter. "Take it out." Slowly, he complied, pulling out his phone and wallet, showing them in open palms. "Turn around," the other officer ordered. Jordan clenched his jaw. "Why?" "Turn around," the first officer repeated, voice sharp, hand resting on his holster. Jordan exhaled, the air feeling too thick in his lungs. He turned, facing the sidewalk. The next moment happened too fast. Rough hands grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back. A knee drove into his spine, forcing him onto the ground. His cheeks scraped against the rough pavement as his body was pinned beneath their weight. "Stop resisting," one of them shouted. "I'm not." Jordan gasped, but the pressure increased. Pain exploded in his ribs. A fist. Then another. The world spun. "Please," his voice was barely a whisper. And then, a presence. A shadow moved at the edge of the street, silent, deadly. The air shifted. The officers didn't notice at first. But then one of them lifted his head, catching sight of the figure emerging from the darkness. A man. Tall, built like stone. His movements fluid yet deliberate. His face was carved with the weariness of war, his gaze sharp as a blade. He exuded something primal, something dangerous. His name was Michael Carter, Jordan's father, and he was the deadliest soldier alive. Michael Carter had spent his life in the shadows, moving like a ghost between war zones, eliminating threats with a precision that few men could match. His name was a whispered legend among soldiers, a nightmare among enemies. He had seen things that could break the average man. He had done things that would haunt most. But none of that compared to the fire that burned inside him now, as he stood on the edge of the street, watching two officers brutalize his son. His boy. His only son. For a fraction of a second, he stood completely still. The cold night air filled his lungs, but inside, he was an inferno. Every muscle in his body coiled with a deadly purpose. His hands, capable of snapping bones and silencing lives, curled into fists. His mind, trained to assess threats within seconds, calculated every move. He noted the officers' stances, the position of their weapons, the tension in their bodies. He could see the arrogance in the way they leaned into their brutality, knowing that no one could stop them. They didn't know. Michael stepped forward. The officer pinning Jordan glanced up, his brows furrowing as he noticed the approaching figure. "Keep walking," he barked, voice laced with the casual authority of a man who thought himself untouchable. Michael said nothing, his eyes locked onto Jordan, taking in the blood smeared on his cheek, the way his fingers twitched against the pavement. His breathing was labored. He was in pain. That was all Michael needed to see. The second officer shifted slightly, resting a hand on his holstered weapon. "I said." Michael moved. A blur of motion, a crack like thunder. The first officer never saw it coming. One moment, he was towering over Jordan. The next, his body crumpled like a rag doll. His feet lifted off the ground before he slammed into the side of the police cruiser. The force of the strike was so devastating that the metal dented inward. He slumped to the ground, unconscious before he even realized what had happened. The second officer had just enough time to react. His fingers grazed the grip of his pistol, but Michael was already there. A lightning-fast strike to the wrist sent the gun skidding across the pavement. A follow-up blow to the throat stole his breath, his knees buckling as he gagged. He tried to scream, but all that came out was a strangled wheeze. Michael caught him before he fell. One arm wrapped around the officer's neck in a vice grip, his other hand pressing down on a pressure point at the base of the skull. The officer's body went limp in seconds, consciousness slipping away like a whisper in the wind. The street was silent. Jordan lay there, staring up in disbelief, his breath hitching in his throat. He had never seen his father fight before. He had heard stories, whispers of classified missions, of a man who moved like a ghost in the night, of a soldier who had done things that defied logic. But seeing it in person was something else entirely. Michael crouched beside him, his rough hands gently gripping his son's shoulders. "Are you hurt?" Jordan swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. I think I'm okay." Michael scanned him with the precision of a battlefield medic, his trained eyes assessing every bruise, every scrape. His jaw tightened. His son had been hurt. That was unacceptable. The faint crackle of a police radio cut through the silence. The officers had called for backup before they even stepped out of the car. Michael's head tilted slightly, listening. He counted at least 3 incoming vehicles. "Can you stand?" Jordan nodded shakily. "Yeah." Michael helped him up, steadying him with an arm. His mind was already working through the next steps. He had been in worse situations before, trapped behind enemy lines, outnumbered and outgunned. The difference was, this wasn't some foreign war zone. This was home. Jordan's voice was hoarse. "Dad, what do we do?" Michael looked down the street. The first patrol car was already turning the corner, headlights cutting through the mist. He exhaled slowly. "We finished this." The car screeched to a halt, doors flying open. More officers spilled out, guns drawn, hands in the air. Now, Michael didn't move. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The air grew thick with the electric charge of tension as the officers leveled their weapons, their shouts echoing through the empty streets. The flashing lights painted everything in sharp, chaotic colors, red, blue, blinking against the concrete and steel. But Michael Carter didn't flinch. He stood firm, an immovable force, his expression carved from stone. He had faced men more dangerous than this. He had been hunted in jungles, stalked through deserts, ambushed in cities where every shadow held a threat. These men, dressed in their blue uniforms with badges that gleamed under the artificial light, had no idea what kind of storm they had just walked into. "Hands up!" One of them barked again, his voice strained. He was nervous. They all were. They could feel it, the presence of something unnatural about this man standing before them, something that didn't fit the mold of a typical civilian. Michael slowly, deliberately, turned his head, taking in the scene with a predator's calm. 4 officers had arrived, weapons raised. 2 more cars were pulling up, tires screeching. He had seconds before this became a full-scale standoff. Jordan stood next to him, breathing heavy, his hands half raised in hesitation. He was terrified, but Michael knew his son wasn't weak. He had been raised by a man who understood the harshness of the world, even if he had been shielded from the worst of it. Until now. One of the officers recognized the 2 unconscious men sprawled on the pavement, the dented squad car behind them. His face paled. "What the hell?" Michael spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the chaos with the weight of something undeniable. "They assaulted my son." "Bullshit." Another officer, taller than the rest, stepped forward, his gun aimed directly at Michael's chest. His badge gleamed under the streetlight. "Sergeant," judging by the insignia. "Step away from him. Now. Hands behind your head." Michael's gaze didn't waver. He could see it all in slow motion, the way the officers shifted their weight, the micro-movements in their trigger fingers, the way their eyes flicked between him and Jordan, calculating, deciding. None of them were truly prepared for what was about to happen. Jordan exhaled sharply, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, don't." Michael didn't respond. His mind was already working through the sequence of events. He counted 6 officers now. 2 more stepping out of their cars, speaking into radios. Reinforcements would come soon. This had to end quickly. The sergeant stepped closer, his grip on his weapon tightening. This is your last warning. On your knees. Hands behind your head. Michael's body coiled like a spring. Then he moved. A blur. A flash of motion so fast that the human eye could barely track it. His left hand shot out, grabbing the sergeant's wrist before the man could react. A precise twist, a snap of bone, a scream. The gun fell from limp fingers. Michael spun, using the man's own weight against him, driving him into the pavement with a brutal efficiency. The other officers barely had time to process before Michael was on them. He closed the distance to the second cop, knocking the firearm aside just as the officer squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, shattering the night, but it went wide, ricocheting off a lamppost. Michael's elbow crashed into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. Before he even hit the ground, Michael was already pivoting, moving toward the next target. A gunshot. Close. Michael ducked, the bullet slicing through the air, just inches from his head. He lunged forward, gripping the shooter's arm, twisting it behind his back in a swift, practiced maneuver. A sharp knee to the ribs sent the officer crumpling with a pained gasp. 3 left. They hesitated. The fear was tangible now, radiating from their wide eyes, their shallow breaths. They had seen the impossible unfold in front of them. In less than 5 seconds, their numbers had been cut in half by a man who moved like a force of nature. Michael locked eyes with the nearest officer. Walk away. The officer swallowed hard, his hand trembling on his weapon. He was young, barely past his mid-20s. His knuckles were white from how tightly he gripped his pistol, but he was smart enough to recognize a losing fight. His fingers relaxed. The gun lowered an inch. Then a voice cut through the air. Freeze! A new arrival. Michael turned his head slightly, his instincts flaring. The man who had spoken was older, grizzled, his uniform slightly different from the others. A captain. His presence radiated authority. But there was something else there, too. Recognition. His eyes weren't just looking at Michael. They were remembering. Michael's own gaze narrowed. He had seen this man before. Captain Reynolds. Years ago. A mission deep in enemy territory, classified beyond even the highest levels of clearance. They had been on opposite sides then, though not as enemies, more like men forced into circumstances neither had control over. They had met in the aftermath of a mission gone wrong, their paths crossing in the kind of way that leaves a permanent mark. The captain took a slow step forward. Michael Carter. His tone wasn't questioning. It was certainty. The remaining officers glanced at their superior, confused. Michael said nothing. His silence was an answer in itself. The captain exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ. He looked around at the unconscious officers, the ruined patrol car, the chaos left in Michael's wake. I should have known it was you. Jordan looked between them, his face a mix of confusion and awe. Dad, what is going on? The captain ignored the question. His eyes stayed on Michael. You know how this ends. You can't take on the entire city. Michael's jaw tightened. He wasn't so sure about that. The captain sighed. Then he did something unexpected. He holstered his weapon. Let him go. The other officers snapped their heads toward him in shock. Sir, that's an order. His tone left no room for argument. Slowly, hesitantly, the officers lowered their weapons. Michael studied the captain, searching for the trap. Why? Reynolds met his gaze with something that looked almost like respect. Because I know who you are, and I know what happens when people push a man like you too far. He gestured toward Jordan. Take your son. Go. Michael didn't move immediately. He didn't trust easily. But after a long moment, he nodded. He turned to Jordan, who still looked stunned, his world completely shattered by what he had just witnessed. Come on, son. Jordan hesitated, glancing at the officers, then back at his father. He didn't ask questions. He simply followed. They disappeared into the night, leaving behind silence, flashing lights, and men who had just learned a lesson they would never forget. As they walked, Jordan finally found his voice. Dad, what are you? Michael didn't answer right away. His mind was still calculating, preparing for whatever came next. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, filled with something deep and unshakable. "I'm a father." And with that, they vanished into the darkness. Michael and Jordan moved swiftly through the dark streets, their footsteps barely making a sound. The night air was cool against their skin, but the heat of what had just transpired still burned in their veins. Jordan's mind raced, replaying every moment, his father moving like a ghost, dismantling trained officers in mere seconds. The look in Captain Reynolds' eyes when he realized who Michael really was. "Dad," Jordan finally said, his voice tight with emotion. "Who are you?" Michael didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the streets ahead, his instincts working faster than his thoughts. They needed to disappear before more police arrived. Reynolds had let them go, but that didn't mean others would. Michael knew how these things worked. A situation like this would escalate. Calls would be made. Powerful people would get involved. He needed to be ahead of it. Only when they reached an abandoned alleyway did Michael stop, pressing his back against the wall. He glanced at Jordan, taking in his son's face. Young, confused, frightened, but still strong. There was something in his eyes that reminded Michael of himself at that age. He exhaled slowly. "We need to keep moving," he said instead. But Jordan wasn't having it. "No, not this time. I just saw you take out 6 cops in under 10 seconds. You moved like some kind of assassin. What are you telling me?" Michael stared at him for a long moment. The truth was complicated. It was dark, and once he let Jordan in, there would be no going back. But the boy deserved answers. He had been dragged into a world he wasn't ready for, and now he had no choice but to understand it. Finally, Michael sighed. "I wasn't always just your father," he admitted. "Before you were born, before I met your mother, I was something else. A soldier. But not just any soldier. I was part of a unit that didn't officially exist. Black operations. Off-the-record missions. We handled things no one else could." Jordan swallowed hard. "Like what?" Michael's gaze darkened. "Eliminations. Extractions. Espionage. You name it. If it was dangerous, we were the ones sent in. No backup. No official record of our existence. We were ghosts." Jordan took a step back. His mind struggled to process the weight of his father's words. "You're saying you were a government hitman?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I did what I was ordered to do, but I left that life behind a long time ago." Jordan shook his head. "Then why did Captain Reynolds know you? Why did he let us go?" Michael exhaled sharply. "Because once upon a time, we were on opposite sides of a mission, and I spared his life." Silence stretched between them. Jordan wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but deep down, he knew this was bigger than him. His father wasn't just some ex-soldier with a shady past. He was something more. Before he could press further, Michael's posture changed. His muscles tensed, his eyes sharpening like a predator sensing danger. Jordan felt it too. Something was off. Then he heard it, the faintest shuffle of footsteps. "Move," Michael ordered, grabbing Jordan's arm and pulling him into the shadows. A second later, 2 black SUVs rolled down the street, their headlights off, their engines nearly silent. Michael recognized the pattern instantly. This wasn't the police. This was something worse. The vehicles came to a stop. 4 men in tactical gear emerged, their movements precise, controlled. Not regular law enforcement. Not gangsters. These were professionals. Jordan's breathing quickened. "Who are they?" Michael's face was stone. "The kind of people I used to work with." The men fanned out, their eyes scanning the streets. One of them spoke into a comm device. No visual yet. They were last seen heading west. Michael clenched his jaw. If these men were here, that meant someone had already put out a high-level alert. They weren't dealing with the local police anymore. This was an extraction team. And there was only one reason an extraction team would be after him. They wanted to erase him. He looked at Jordan. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say." Jordan nodded, fear creeping into his expression. Michael's mind raced. They needed to get out of the area fast, but they were boxed in. The men were spreading out, checking every possible hiding place. If he didn't act now, they would be surrounded. Michael reached into his jacket, pulling out a small tactical knife, his only weapon. It wasn't much, but in the right hands, it was deadlier than a gun. He waited until one of the operatives moved close, then struck. Lightning fast, he grabbed the man from behind, covering his mouth as he drove the blade deep into his side. A muffled gasp, a twitch of resistance, then nothing. Michael eased the body to the ground silently, retrieving the man's sidearm in the process. 1 down, 3 to go. But his luck didn't hold. Contact! One of the other operatives spun, raising his rifle. Michael pushed Jordan behind cover just as gunfire erupted. Bullets shredded through the alley walls, sparks flying as rounds ricocheted off brick and metal. Michael returned fire with the stolen pistol, dropping another man with a precise headshot. The remaining 2 moved fast, ducking behind cover, coordinating their attack. These weren't amateurs. Michael gritted his teeth. He was outnumbered, and Jordan was vulnerable. He needed an exit. Then, out of nowhere, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the street. "Stand down." Everything went still. Michael's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. A figure stepped out of the second SUV. He was tall, built like a tank, his face hardened by years of war. His presence alone was enough to command attention. Jordan whispered, "Who is that?" Michael didn't take his eyes off the man. "His name is Colonel Adrian Wolfe." Jordan frowned. "You know him?" Michael's expression darkened. "He trained me." Wolfe took a slow step forward, his piercing gaze locked onto Michael. "It's been a long time, Carter." Michael kept his grip on the gun. "Not long enough." Wolfe smirked. "You always were difficult, but I'm not here to kill you." Michael didn't relax. "Then why are you here?" Wolfe's smirk faded. "Because someone wants you back, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen." Michael's stomach turned. He had spent years escaping his past, building a life for Jordan away from the bloodshed. But now the past had come knocking, and it wasn't leaving without him. Jordan looked between them, confusion and fear on his face. "Dad, what's happening?" Michael's grip on the gun tightened. He had 2 choices: go with Wolfe and face whatever horrors waited for him, or fight. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.